Hello everyone, and welcome to this presentation. My name is Chris. I'm a second year PhD student at Queen's University Belfast. And my presentation today concerns the measurement of energy and transport poverty. To begin with, I will define the problems, then I will discuss how these issues link, then I will discuss how these conditions are measured, and then obstacles to joining these areas of study, current limitations on putting this work into practice, and lastly, I'll discuss who the Fuel Poverty Research Network should seek to collaborate with to further this research area. To begin with, we're going to start with some definitions. So energy poverty, we will define as the inability to secure materially and socially necessitated energy services, such as heating a home or using appliances. In the UK and Ireland, historically this has been referred to as fuel poverty. There are a number of key drivers of this condition, namely the household income, the cost of fuel, or rather energy, the efficiency of the home and the home heating system, the occupancy of your building, your ability to use energy efficiently, and your attitudes to energy use, your ability to respond to price signals, and lastly, your ability to adapt to new technologies. Meanwhile, transport poverty is the enforced lack of mobility services that we need to participate fully in society, which result from either the inaccessibility of transport, its unaffordability, or its unavailability. In turn, the contributors of transport poverty are its cost, which options you have available to you, the availability in turn of those options, the location and the accessibility of the services you wish to access, the quantity of time you spend travelling, and the safety of your modes of transport. These conditions overlap in a number of ways. These are either consequences or causes of each condition. Circled in blue, you'll see the conditions and consequences of energy poverty. Circled in red, you'll see the causes and consequences of transport poverty. And in purple, the areas which overlap these conditions. The overlapping causes and consequences are debt, low income, high fuel costs, either in the energy or transport sphere, exposure to externalities, the location of your household, your educational attainment, and your mental and physical health. So why should we care about these conditions? Well, in the first instance, fuel and transport poverty leads to increased mortality. Indeed, in the UK, between 2011 and 2017, nearly 17,000 people died because of fuel poverty. It also causes poor physical and mental health. This condition is thought to affect between 50 and 125 million households EU-wide. Transport poverty restricts access to employment, which in turn depresses the economy, causes air pollution, which leads to increased rates of mortality, and it also causes greater difficulties for the disabled. And so, alleviating these conditions can be seen as part of the just transition. Indeed, the just transition is now gaining traction at the highest levels of political power in the EU. And furthermore, in the context of the future work in this project, we consider that building political capital and maintaining the social license of corporations to operate to be particularly important. So how do we measure energy poverty? There are three main means of doing so. The first concerns measuring expenditure against a threshold. This is common in the UK, where we see both the 10% and the low income high cost indicator being used. Secondly, we have consensual measures, where households are asked, do they subjectively find that their energy bills are difficult to pay? And lastly, though rarely used in the energy poverty literature, is direct measurement of energy use. I'd recommend pausing this presentation at this point in time if you want to read the slide in more detail. There's also an example calculation on the left. Transport poverty measures, meanwhile, cover three areas: measures of mobility, measures of accessibility, and measures of transport affordability. The analogy with energy poverty has been recognised in the 10% transport indicator. But other than this, measurements have not really overlapped historically. Again, you may wish to pause the slideshow at this point to read it in more detail. As these fields unify, the question arises in how do we measure them together? This literature review has found one prominent example of an attempt to measure both energy and transport poverty under the same indicator. This is a new area under development and will require further research. Again, you may wish to pause the slideshow at this point to read the contents of this slide. Conducting a bibliometric analysis as part of this literature review led to a number of conclusions regarding the obstacles to unifying these areas of research. Firstly, we see that concerns regarding a just transition in fuel poverty run high in the social sciences, but are rare elsewhere. Indeed, intercluster work itself is rare. Meanwhile, the body of literature in transport poverty is significantly smaller than that in energy and fuel poverty, and it is also much more nebulous than the fuel poverty corpus. Indeed, terms of art in both areas of research appear to be exclusionary, stopping other disciplines from crossing into these areas. On the basis of journal titles, we draw preliminary conclusions that fuel poverty is rarely studied in disciplines which consider themselves quantitative. For example, are economists capturing the full return on investment if they do not consider items such as the benefits of alleviating fuel poverty? If we're not measuring improvements to equity, can we be sure that we value them? Meanwhile, in transport poverty research, this is focused on the disciplines of geography and policy. Again, we see a lack of interdisciplinarity and also a lack of focus on technical solutions to these issues. Regarding how we measure these conditions, we identified a number of issues. Firstly, the unit of measurement. In transport poverty, an individual may be transport poor, but in energy poverty, it is the household. The definition or metric used to measure each condition inherently changes the scale. There are standards set for energy services, but not for transport. Actual versus required spend on energy or transport services may differ, and modelled versus actual use of energy and transport services is not considered. Many thresholds are out of date, for example, the 10% indicator. Today, this is essentially arbitrary. Indeed, these thresholds may not necessarily equate to financial burden. Dimensionality. These metrics often do not tell us how or why an individual is energy or transport poor. And lastly, they frequently neglect choice, whereby some people may choose to live in, for example, rural areas with reduced access to services, yet do not necessarily consider themselves as living in a condition of poverty. In order to overcome these problems, we suggest that a combination of metrics in both conditions and/or either is better than any single metric alone. These should be accompanied by extra factors such as health indicators or air pollution data. However, we note that data is a limitation and that the design of metrics and in turn data collection presents a chicken and egg problem. Thus, assessing who is vulnerable to each condition is easier than measuring it. Therefore, it's suggested that vulnerability and quantitative metrics should be layered. Lastly, we have defined required standards in energy poverty, but we haven't defined them in transport. We also have not considered how they may trade off against each other in a future unified energy and transport system, and thus there's a need for an assessment of these standards. And so, in this way, we might arrive at a more comprehensive assessment of who is affected by these conditions. Regarding current policy responses, our results indicate that two areas really need to be enhanced. Firstly, in terms of physical solutions, Metrics do not mitigate for the need for on-site inspection, particularly with regards to home heating solutions. Often these mean swapping one fossil fuel for another, for example an oil-fired boiler for a gas-fired one. Offerings in improving home insulation are often limited, and in turn these are often needs-based. Defining these needs is again difficult, and also, frankly, lacks ambition. Meanwhile, economic issues also present themselves. Firstly, the sums of money on offer are typically very low, and in turn this means that they're insufficient to mobilise markets for novel solutions. Lastly, enacting these solutions, they're often subcontracted, and thus authorities are left with no liability in these areas. So to put these metrics to better use, we should again be gathering more data. We should be looking at dwelling location, its type, proximities to heat networks, local fuel supplies, etc. Currently these items require inspection, which are expensive and time consuming, but could be collected at the point of survey, and thus allow the metrics to be put to better use. Next, we ought to stipulate standards of travel, and we should do this with the additional use of vulnerability lenses and a holistic assessment of transport services, such that we might see where energy services might mitigate for the need for transport services. And so who might the Fuel Poverty Research Network look to for collaboration to further this area of research? On this slide is listed the top 5 authors in transport poverty as found in this literature review. We suggest these people will be an excellent starting point for furthering this research. Thank you for listening, and these are my contact details should anyone wish to reach out to discuss this further. References are available here and here. Thank you again.